Hello gardeners, it's Fred with Sugar Creek Gardens here to talk about some of the top plant selections for perennial gardens. We're doing this presentation specifically for Jefferson County Library patrons, but obviously everyone can benefit from these tips, and because Jeffco gardeners are frequently victimized by deer browsing, we're going to focus on plants that deer tend to avoid. We'll be talking about easy to grow perennials for sun, part sun, and shade, shrubs for sun or part sun, and we'll finish up with things you can be doing for fall. Now, because we're in the midst of a pandemic, Sugar Creek remains closed to on-ground shopping, so here's how you can do some online browsing and ordering. Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder database is a great way to find plants, and you can use the drop-down menus and check the various boxes to filter your search. We mentioned browsing deer, which frustrate a lot of gardeners in the outer suburbs and surrounding counties. So this Rutgers University database is very helpful in identifying the right kind of plant. Just key in those search terms and you'll get a good sense of what works and what doesn't. One thing that usually puzzles inexperienced gardeners is sun requirement. Plant tags with full sun often suggest that a plant get at least 6 hours of direct sun. A part sun plant might want at least 4 hours, but the plants don't always follow the grower's advice, and I've grown so-called full sun plants in way less than 6 hours of direct light, and part sun plants in more than the recommended amount. Ornamental grasses tend to be one of those exceptions. The bigger varieties tend to flop without at least 6 hours, and most are happy with all-day sun. Before we get into sun perennials, I wanted to talk briefly about soil, which is a topic that gardeners can tend to ignore. But after spending a lot of money on plants, it's often difficult to go that extra mile on soil amendments. But without good soil, it's like a house without a foundation. And so for a newer bed, it's really important to work in compost in the planting hole. Then covering your entire bed with an inch or two of wood mulch not only will improve the overall look, but contribute to plant health. And a word about well-drained soil. You see this a lot in plant descriptions, and it doesn't mean that your soil is well-drained if the plantings are on a hill or an incline. What it refers to is the evaporation of water in the soil. So in a heavy clay soil, for example, water evaporates slowly and can cause root rot. If you have a lot of clay, and most people do, it's really essential to amend your soil. And just as I would like you to work on your soil, here are some of the easiest plants to grow, but in below average and often rocky soil. Ornamental grasses are versatile because they thrive in harsh conditions, come in many varieties, sizes, and different shades of color. Many have attractive tassels in summer. They don't require much water once established. Fertilizer isn't really required, and they look good in winter. Just be sure to cut them near the ground before new growth emerges in spring. The big miscanthus grass can be an effective screen, but it turns some people off because it gets extremely wide over time and can be difficult to transplant. Once you start to see no growth from the center of the plant, it's time to dig up the live growth and either reposition or get it started in another area. The pennisetum is a short to medium-sized fountain grass and is among the more attractive ornamental grasses. And Carl Forster is the popular and widely used Calamagrostis because of its striking upright growth habit. The Hacknicloa here, known as Japanese forest grass, is an outlier because it prefers a lot of shade and good well-drained soil, which encourages its rhizomes to spread into a short but attractive ground cover. Some of the popular Missouri natives here are switchgrass, little bluestem, pink muley grass, prairie dropseed, and blue grama. As with most plants, you'll get a great look if you plant your grasses in multiples, either in hedge form or as focal points throughout a bigger bed. So sometimes you have to experiment, and in the case of the allium, it's very versatile, one of my favorite plants because of its long bloom, its popularity with bees, and its near zero maintenance. A lot of gardeners are familiar with the taller alliums with their big white or purple ball-shaped flowers that bloom in spring. The pictured shorter variety called Millennium blooms in late July and keeps going for about 6 weeks. When the bloom is done, the skeleton seed heads persist through much of winter, and late winter cleanup is quick and easy. Baptisia is commonly known as false indigo because it was used by early American colonists as substitutes for making dyes. The pea-like flowers are attractive to butterflies and other insect pollinators. This is a low-maintenance, easy-to-grow plant that develops a large taproot and shouldn't be transplanted once established. And it requires some patience as it develops that taproot, so it typically won't flower fully until its third season. Coreopsis is a popular long-blooming perennial. It is available in many different foliage and flower types and ranges from under a foot in height to up to 3 feet. And it's another one of those easy-to-grow plants that will spread readily into an attractive ground cover. Compact plants are less likely to sprawl than taller varieties, and they can be somewhat short-lived, so the self-seeding helps assure you've got fresh plants each year. The Missouri native purple coneflower isn't just purple anymore. In recent years, growers have tinkered with not only the flower color but flower structure with crazy names like double scoop bubblegum. But the stray species Echinacea purpurea is a long-blooming workhorse that will naturalize and attract birds and butterflies and provide winter interest. It'll self-seed as well, unlike many of the fancy cultivars that are sterile and can have reduced viability. If you're in search of the perfect plant, this one comes pretty close. I gave this Calameris Blue Star a tryout several years ago and was thrilled at how it performed. This is one of those rare perennials that start blooming in June and basically never stop. It's an ideal border plant, as you see here, growing next to some contrasting marigolds. The flower is a light lavender with a pop of yellow in the center. It's tolerant of both wet and dry conditions and does fine in less than full sun. And like a lot of smaller perennials, it'll provide the best look if planted in multiples. Monarda, known as bee balm, is a mint family plant but not considered invasive. The Bradburyiana species, pictured above, is the Missouri native that will grow 1 to 2 feet tall. Other species can reach 3 feet or more, such as the popular Jacob Klein cultivar pictured at left. You'll enjoy plenty of hummingbirds and butterflies during their May and June bloom. Here are a couple of plants with bluish blooms that have similar growth habits. Russian sage on the left thrives in all-day sun but needs good soil because drainage is important. It's got a long bloom starting later in July, and the plant should be cut to the ground in late winter. Plants typically reach 4 feet in height, but shorter cultivars are available. Catmint is a low grower that blooms in April and can sprawl a bit, and it's a good plant to pair with roses because it'll cover up the unappealing lower area of that shrub. Shearing the flower spikes after their initial bloom will promote more blooms. The salvia genus has more than 900 species of annuals, biennials, perennials, and shrubs, but many gardeners are familiar with the under 2 foot tall spiky flowered variety that blooms purple, blue, violet, and magenta. These plants are clump forming and perform well in well-drained soil in full sun, and you can encourage later blooms by shearing spent flowers. The red and purple bedding annuals are great for perennial borders or containers. Tender perennials like black and blue and amistad often overwinter in our region and have a distinctive flower that, like other salvias, attract bees and hummingbirds. I'm always on the lookout for foliage plants that provide contrast to the mostly green plants that we tend to grow, and this Stachys, better known as lamb's ear, is truly unique with its soft, velvety silver gray leaves. Back in that grueling summer of 2012, when we had many 100-degree days and little rain, I wasn't real crazy about the lamb's ear, and I intentionally didn't water it at all summer, but it didn't complain at all. On the downside, too much water and humidity can lead to leaf dieback, which usually only provides a minor setback to the plant. Its flower stalk isn't particularly attractive, but it does attract bees. Here's another species of Stachys called Humelo that is totally different, with pretty purple flowers that appear on dense spikes above mostly leafless stems. The clumps can spread over time and form a dense ground cover, and in our milder winters, the foliage remains evergreen. This was the Perennial Plant Association's 2019 Perennial of the Year. The Black-Eyed Susan is another garden workhorse and a Missouri native, growing easily in either moist or dry conditions, and it's one of those plants that when you start with a few, you end up with many. Some species will spread by rhizomes, while others grow like annuals but self-seed profusely. That's the case with the Indian summer cultivar pictured here. It has one of the biggest blooms and will flower from mid-June to September. Moving on to shade and part sun plants, this is where you might want to experiment. Plants labeled for part sun can often handle more than 4 hours or so if they're getting only morning exposure, and even full shade plants like ferns can handle a little bit of sun, more in the morning, less in the afternoon. Amsonia has Missouri and Midwest native species, and this is one of my favorites because it will grow happily in a lot of sun or a fair amount of shade with really no attention at all. Plus, it'll handle wet conditions, so it's a great rain garden plant, and it also tolerates drought. And it's got a nice pale lavender flower that attracts early season butterflies. Its ferny foliage stands out against broadleaf foliage companions, and the bright yellow foliage you see here persists into late fall. When that fades, the grayish stems provide winter interest. Another popular Amsonia is the native Tabernae montana species here in the upper right. By comparison, its foliage is more dense and doesn't turn yellow in the fall. Here's another great foliage plant that will stand out amid a lot of green, the shrub-like Sun King Aralia. This is said to be a popular plant with birds that snack on late summer berries, but I have to report that my 5-year-old Sun King has never produced them. Still, it's an attractive plant that essentially requires no care and will provide a nice pop of color in shade. I had to go back to 2002 to find my first experience with Brunnera macrophylla. I bought 3 plants in early April that year and was blown away by the forget-me-not style blue flowers just a few weeks later. It remains one of my favorite plants for shade, and as you can see by the photo here, it's turned into a really showy ground cover, and this is just one area it's established itself in. It can handle some sun, but mainly morning sun, and it likes a moist soil. In too much sun, it'll burn up and appear dead, but always comes back the next spring. Plenty of really attractive cultivars have been produced in recent years, and some are pictured here, but they don't seem to spread like the straight species, and seeds from the variegated forms may not produce that variegation. True blue flowers in nature are uncommon, which makes this rhizome-spreading ground cover a real winner because it blooms from July to frost in full to part sun. Ceratostigmas, shiny green leaves turn a bronzy red in fall, and its wiry winter stems should be sheared to the ground before its new growth emerges in spring. In the midst of my Brunnera are colonies of Solomon's seal, shown here, because it too is a slow spreader via its rhizomes. To help that spread, you'll need organically rich and well-drained soil and fold-apart shade. The foliage has a graceful arcing habit, which will totally cover the ground below it, and produces bell-shaped flowers in April. It's very versatile, thriving in both wet conditions and tolerating drought. And its fall color is interesting as well, shown here with a dusting of November snow. This was the Perennial Plant Association's 2013 Perennial of the Year, and well-deserving. Ferns are a woodland plant and thrive in organically rich, well-drained soil with dry to medium moisture. This means fold-apart shade, so dappled sun or a brief shot of morning sun are ideal. For those who can't use hostas because of deer browsing, different fern types can be used to create an attractive ground cover for shade. The Japanese painted fern here is under a foot tall and is an ideal border plant. The shield fern is a Missouri native, about 2 feet tall, and remains evergreen in winter. The maidenhair fern, another native, will get about 2.5 feet and can form large colonies over time. The Christmas fern is also a native, about 2 feet tall, and remains evergreen in winter. The ostrich fern can easily surpass 3 feet, or much taller in cooler, moist conditions. It can also form large colonies over time. And the lady fern is another native that can reach 3 feet and can tolerate drier soil than other types. Hellebores are known as Lenten rose for their pretty late winter flowers, which come in multiple color combinations depending on the variety. This is a nice, easy-to-grow staple in any shady landscape, and besides the flower, its mounding dark green foliage is evergreen. This plant likes a rich, well-drained soil, which can encourage it to self-seed. Heuchera is a genus of about 55 species of evergreen to semi-evergreen perennials, and starting in the early 1980s, Hybridizers have turned these plants into showstoppers with foliage shades of green, blue-green, violet, purple, maroon, bronze, silver-black, orange, yellow, yellow, or red. The leaves can be streaked, mottled, or marbled variegation that sometimes includes contrasting veins. Tiny flowers appear on tall, bare stems, but this plant really isn't growing for its flowers. Yet it's a perfect plant for injecting color into the landscape. Hostas are just one of the best, easy-to-grow plants for shade you can find, with an endless number of varieties and sizes that range from a few inches to several feet, in multiple colors and textures. They all flower at various stages in summer, depending on the type, but these plants are grown for their foliage, and for gardeners who have a lot of ground to cover, look for bigger varieties that will spread around 4 feet or more. Just make sure you've got no deer in your neighborhood. Liriope, also known as monkey grass or lily turf, is a short grass-like plant that's popular on borders and produces a purple flower in late summer. It performs beautifully in a lot of sun or a lot of shade, but it's important to pay attention to which species you're shopping for. Gardeners can accidentally buy the aggressive spreader when they want the clumper. But the spreader has a lot of value for covering large areas. The Japanese garden at the Missouri Botanical Garden has large swaths of it. This plant will provide winter interest but needs to be mowed or weed-whacked in late winter. Starting in July, cardinal flower is a long-blooming Missouri native and has a certain popularity with our friend in the photo, along with butterflies. Cardinals, not so much. It grows narrowly up to 4 feet, so planting these in multiples will provide the best look, and this is one that will thrive in a rain garden setting in full to part sun. Plants can be short-lived, but don't worry, they produce enough new plants from seed to keep you and the hummers happy. Japanese Pachysandra is a dense evergreen ground cover for full shade to part sun, and it'll spread best in organically rich, well-drained soil. These plants are typically sold in flats of 36 plugs and should be planted 6 to 12 inches apart, depending upon how fast you want to create your ground cover. Just as early spring plants are starting to emerge, Pachysandra produces a small bottle brush white flower. Pulmonaria is a great companion plant to our earlier featured Brunnera because it blooms about the same time and produces showy flower combinations in magenta, coral pink, and purple, depending upon the cultivar. And like Brunnera, once the bloom is gone, the foliage is a standout, typically blotches of silver white on green, or in the case of the one at left, quite bright. Shrubs are essential to any landscape because they not only add beauty on a larger scale than many perennials, but they can also provide protection for birds as well as add value to your property. When you hear the term curb appeal, it's shrubs that play a large role in achieving that attractive look. So let's take a look at some shrubs for different light conditions that'll provide some good options. Butterfly bushes have become quite popular because more and more dwarf varieties are being produced, which makes them an easier fit in a lot of smaller landscapes. A newer miniature butterfly bush series called Lo and Behold produces 2-foot-tall plants that bloom from June to October. Plant butterfly bushes in well-drained soil in full sun because they won't perform as well in poorly drained conditions in less than full sun. The top growth tends to die back in winter, so it's recommended to cut these plants to the ground before the new growth emerges. Boxwoods are probably the most versatile evergreens available, widely used as a foundation planting for year-round interest in both sun or shade, and also available in many sizes and shapes, and even shades of green, yellow, and cream. In addition to foundation plantings, they add focal points to any garden bed. On the left here, you'll see 3 large green velvet boxwoods in the back of this bed. They were a little unkempt when this photo was taken, but they're happy to grow that way or be trimmed and shaped to whatever your preference is. The smaller variegated boxwoods in the lower left are called Golden Triumph, and you see its close-up in the lower right. Popular upright boxwoods include Green Mountain and Green Tower. Green Mountain is wider, and Green Tower eventually gets taller. Here's my beautyberry shrub, which has some interesting branching, but isn't all that attractive until late summer when the purple berries emerge in bunches. It's good in average soil in full sun or part shade, and it's popular with birds. Mine is actually in a spot where shade has increased a lot over the years, and it still performs beautifully. If you need a shrub to fill some horizontal space, this one will get about 5 feet wide. And a maintenance tip, it's a good idea to cut this shrub to about 6 inches off the ground in late winter. Otherwise, you'll end up with a lot of bare stems amid the new growth. Chamaecyparis shrubs can be an acquired taste for some gardeners because of their unique foliage, but for those who want to diversify their landscape with contrasting foliage structure and color, this one works well. It's an evergreen conifer that maintains its look year-round. They're easy to grow in well-drained soil and full-to-part sun, and typically can get 5 to 6 feet or taller, but also come in dwarf sizes. Varieties are both yellow and green, and be sure to pay attention to the plant tag because smaller versions look virtually identical to the larger ones. Hydrangeas are among the showiest and longest blooming shrubs available, and for gardeners in deer country are often not an option. But those able to grow hydrangeas will be richly rewarded. So I wanted to talk about the 5 popular species and clear up the typical confusion about their various growing requirements. Pictured here is a quercifolia species, better known as the oakleaf hydrangea. It's a spectacular shrub that can get 8 feet or so tall with huge leaves and foot-long cone-shaped flowers. And for gardeners who don't have the room, smaller versions are now available. The white flowers appear in June and attract bees, and a couple of weeks later the flowers transition to pink, as you can see in the lower right here. Eventually the flowers get a bronzy color shown in the upper left, and that's really the only drawback for this shrub, the late season flower color. But look at the fall color, and this photo was taken in early December. In the lower photos, not even a January ice storm bothered the flowers, and in the lower right, note the orange-shaded bark and flower skeletons in late winter. Oak leaves grow in average soil in sun or part shade. They bloom on the previous season's growth, so pruning in midsummer will preserve a lot of those buds. The overwintered flower stalks can be pruned or snipped off in late winter, or you can do this in fall if you want a cleaner look. Be sure to give this one plenty of room to stretch out because it's a vigorous grower. Here are examples of the arborescens species. Probably the most popular variety is the Incrediball with its big white ball flowers that transition to a lime color later in the season. Cultivars like the Invincible Spirit series are producing colorful flowers, and even dwarf versions like the 2-foot-tall Wee White shown in the lower right. Now, if you want to feed the bees, you'll have to settle on the native or wild hydrangea, which is a Missouri native. All arborescens varieties bloom on the current season's growth, so they can be shaped or pruned hard in late winter. They do well in various amounts of sunlight. Moving on to the paniculata or panicle hydrangea. Like the oak leaf, this is another big showstopper shrub with a lot of cultivars. As you see here with the quickfire panicle, the flowers start out white and then transition to a sharp pink later in summer. Many dwarf versions are available, like the bobo pictured on the left with a close-up of the flowers on the right. The panicle hydrangeas thrive in full sun but also can handle some shade, and unlike the arborescens varieties, flower production can be limited for the first couple of seasons as the plants develop their roots. The serrata species, or mountain hydrangea, has become popular in recent years with the introduction of the Tough Stuff series. These shrubs will remind gardeners of the lace-cap flower produced by the macrophylla hydrangeas, and like the macrophylla, they bloom on the previous season's growth but are more reliable bloomers. And like the macrophylla, acidic soil produces blue flowers, alkaline soil produces pink flowers, and they prefer protection from the intense afternoon sun. Now we get to the black sheep of hydrangeas, the macrophylla, which in recent years, because of our changing climate, have produced many more complaints than flowers. When they do flower, either in a ball shape or lace cap form, they are probably the prettiest of all the hydrangeas. Pictured here is an old-fashioned Nico blue hydrangea in one of those rare years, I think about 10 years ago, that it really performed well. Note the interesting blend of both acidic and alkaline soil it detected with the blue and pink and sometimes purplish blooms. On the right is a really pretty lady in red hydrangea with its distinctive foliage and stems and lack of flowers. But when it does bloom, it's a favorite with bees. So what's the problem with the macrophyllas? The buds that emerge on the previous season's growth are often damaged by either a cold winter or a spring freeze. The newer varieties, like Endless Summer, bloom on both the previous and current season's growth, but often what happens is you'll have no blooms in late spring and have to wait until late in the season to see any blooms at all. So even in the best of growing conditions, you'll have stem dieback, and you'll need to cut those stems back to the ground when you don't detect any viable buds. Also prune back any dead upper stem to a live bud. The Itea, or Virginia sweetspire, is a really versatile and easy to grow shrub and has some distinctive features. It's one of those plants that will thrive in wet or dry conditions and sun or a fair amount of shade. And it's a suckering plant, though not invasively, so you can use it as a smaller hedge. Here you can see the long finger-like flowers that bloom in May and the bright orange-red fall color that won't totally disappear until December. The straight species is a Missouri native and can get 5 to 6 feet tall, and the popular cultivars are Little Henry and the fragrant Scentlandia, which generally grow to about 3 feet. Here's another small, really useful shrub, Spirea. There are a bunch of really great low-maintenance Japanese Spirea now that have yellow or yellow-red, orange combinations of foliage and pink flowers, typically growing only about 2 to 3 feet tall and wide. So these are more good options to introduce color into your landscape without worrying about a short-lived flower. Like the beautyberry, these shrubs benefit from a hard pruning in late winter. You'll get a flush of fresh foliage and not have to deal with stem dieback. Viburnum has many species and is a popular big shrub for our region for their spring flower and fall berries that attract birds. They're easy to grow in well-drained soil and full sun to part shade, and there are some key differences among the species. The Korean spice viburnum has a very fragrant flower, and some, like the birkwood, have showy red fall color. And two that keep their foliage for much of the winter are Prague and leatherleaf. The old-fashioned weigela is a big green shrub with a short-lived spring flower, but today's gardeners can select numerous hybrids from small to large that are hard to ignore. The newer varieties typically bloom a sharp magenta or rose pink in spring and will get a later summer bloom as well. The non-green foliage varieties, combined with massive flower production, really provide pop in any landscape. They perform best in full sun and well-drained soil and will attract hummingbirds. So here we are with fall around the corner after what's been a pleasant summer for the most part. And this photo reminds me what's really disappointing about fall, and that's having to cut down my giant elephant ears and store the bulbs. Here's what the excavation looked like after I let them dry out for a day or two last year. These bulbs are easy to overwinter. I just drop them into a garbage bag and store them in the basement. The smaller elephant ear style caladiums and other tender bulbs can be a little more challenging, so you might search for care instructions at mobot.org. You can get good information there on canna, dahlias, and gladiolas. Pansies and mums are colorful and popular plants for fall, and many gardeners discard them after a hard freeze. But many mums will overwinter, and most pansy varieties will perk up in a big way at the hint of warm spring weather. In fact, if you're planning to plant pansies for their early color, do it in the fall because the plants will have time to bulk up a bit and be even more spectacular in spring. Eventually, as the temps rise in May and June, they'll need to be replaced with summer annuals or perhaps perennials. Otherwise, fall is a great time to get started for next spring. This is a perfect time to divide plants that are getting too big, like the ornamental grasses or any other plant you'd like to get established in another bed. Fall is an even better time for both transplanting and adding new plants because the soil is much warmer than in spring, and this will give those plantings a head start on root development. Plus, many nurseries are looking to clear off their shelves, so to speak, and will offer discounts. Here's another Mobot page I'm going to recommend, and I've included a shortened URL you can copy, or you can go to mobot.org and search for gardening by month. You'll get links to provide tips and tasks, and also pests and problems for every month of the year. So for September, you can plant spring bulbs, though you'll want to wait until cooler days of October for tulips. This is a good time to divide and transplant peonies. If you have trees and you don't have a compost bin, this would be a good time to start one. The leaves will break down much quicker if you mow over them a few times, and it's actually a good idea to just leave those chopped leaves on your yard if you don't rake them into the compost pile. This is also the best time to seed or reseed a lawn. Resist doing this in spring because soil temps are cooler and it takes longer for seeds to germinate. And before long, we get summer temps that add more stress to these new plantings, often with disappointing results. So there you have it. I hope you've gotten some helpful tips on beautifying your garden. One tip I always mention when recommending plants is to plant them in multiples, typically odd numbers. It's like moving puzzle pieces into place until they all fit reasonably. Now, if you can just figure out a way to add multiple gardeners, as I did, you'll have it made in the shade.